Diane's voice hit the microphone at the exact moment the champagne flute in my father's hand started to shake. The day she told this family she was joining the military, she said, smiling out at 400 donors in tuxedos and diamonds, I told her chasing a uniform was just a phase. A little tomboy rebellion she'd grow out of, once she remembered she was born into something better than crawling through dirt for a paycheck. A ripple of polite laughter moved through the ballroom like wind through wheat. She let it breathe. She always let the cruelty breathe before she delivered the knife. Well, she continued, touching the diamond at her throat, I suppose some phases just never end. That was the sentence hanging in the air, gold-plated and glittering under 6 crystal chandeliers, when the ballroom doors at the back of the room did not open. They were kicked. One heavy black boot, a crack of wood against wood loud enough to stop 400 conversations in half a second. And Master Sergeant Danny Reyes walked into my father's $12 million real estate gala wearing his dress blues, 3 rows of ribbon he'd bled for pinned crooked, because he'd dressed in a car on the way over. He didn't look at Diane. He didn't look at the stage, the chandeliers, the ice sculpture shaped like my father's company logo melting quietly in the corner. He looked straight through 400 strangers until he found me standing near the back wall in my service uniform. The one Diane had specifically asked me not to wear tonight because it would compete with the aesthetic. He stopped 11 feet away. He snapped his heels together so hard the sound cracked off the marble like a rifle shot, and he raised a salute so sharp it looked like it could cut glass. My father's champagne flute slipped out of his fingers. It didn't shatter dramatically, it just tipped, slow and stupid, and hit the floor with a small, embarrassed sound, and the pale gold liquid spread out across the marble in a shape like a country nobody had ever mapped. Diane's mouth was still open. The microphone was still live. Every camera in that room, the ones hired to capture the Cole family legacy gala for the society pages, turned toward the back of the room instead, toward the man in dress blues, holding his salute like his arm had been welded into place, and toward me, standing very still, not moving to return it yet, because I wanted every single person in that room to understand exactly what they were looking at before I gave him permission to lower his hand. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I have been accused of both too much ice and too much fire in my life, usually by people who never had to decide, in real time, whether a stranger bleeding out on foreign concrete was worth the risk of my own body. I raised my hand and returned the salute, slow, deliberate, and the sound of Diane's heels against the stage as she took one small step backward was the loudest thing in the room. My father found something to say before anyone else did, because silence has always terrified him more than truth ever could. This is a private event, he said, too loud, his voice cracking on the second word. Reyes didn't lower his arm. He didn't even turn his head toward my father. With respect, sir, he said, in the flat, unbothered voice men use when they've already decided a threat isn't worth their attention. I'm not here for you. Diane's hand found the edge of the podium like she needed it to remain standing. Somewhere near the back, a photographer's shutter went off twice, fast, the sound sharp enough to make 3 donors flinch, and I understood in that instant that whatever happened in the next 10 minutes was never going to stay inside that ballroom. It was going to end up in print, in pixels, in a story with my name attached to it, that I had not written, and could no longer control the shape of. I have run toward gunfire with less fear in my chest than I felt watching that first camera flash. But to understand why a decorated pararescueman crashed a black-tie gala to salute a woman his hostess had just called a phase, and why his arrival was only the beginning of what that ballroom was about to lose, you have to go back 19 years. To a bedroom that smelled like dust and expensive grief, and a watch that stopped at 4:47 inches the afternoon and never moved again. My mother's name was Eleanor. She died on a Tuesday in March, on a stretch of wet highway 11 minutes from our house, and the last thing she was doing was driving to pick me up from a chess tournament I never got to finish. I was 9. The watch on her wrist, a plain gold thing, nothing fancy. A gift from her own mother, stopped the moment the paramedics cut it off her to run a line into her arm, and nobody ever wound it again. I found it 3 days after the funeral, in a shoebox in my father's closet, where he'd shoved everything of hers that made the house feel too much like a place she used to live. I took it. I never told him. I have kept it in a drawer in every apartment, every barracks room, every deployment footlocker I have owned since I was 9 years old. And some nights, when the noise in my head got loud enough, I would take it out and hold it and listen to the silence where ticking should have been, because at least the silence was honest. Nothing else in that house ever was. My father remarried within 14 months. Diane arrived with a 5-year-old son named Preston, a closet full of tailored blazers, and a talent for turning a room's temperature down 10 degrees with a single compliment. She never raised her voice at me. That was the trick of her, she didn't need to. She could gut you in 6 words delivered with a warm smile over a dinner table, and everyone at that table would laugh, and you would sit there wondering if you'd imagine the knife because nobody else seemed to see it going in. Preston learned her methods before he ever learned to tie his own shoes. He was 5 when he moved in, 7 when he figured out that the fastest way to earn his mother's warm laugh was to say something small and sharp about me at exactly the right moment. I remember him at 8 years old, standing in the doorway of my room while I built a model airplane kit my mother had bought me 2 months before she died, watching me glue a wing into place with the kind of careful, holy patience only grieving children have, and I remember him picking up my mother's watch off my nightstand. The one thing in that house I had never once let out of arm's reach, turning it over in his small hands, and asking, in a voice that already had Diane's syrup baked into it, "Why do you keep a broken thing?" Mom says broken things just take up space. I didn't answer him. I took the watch back out of his hand hard enough that he yelped, and Diane appeared in the doorway 30 seconds later, not to ask what happened, but to tell me, gently, warmly, in the exact tone she used on donors 2 decades later, that I needed to be more careful with my little brother's feelings. I remember the night the real pattern set in, clearer than I remember most of the men I've pulled out of burning wreckage. I was 14. I'd placed first in the regional science fair with a project on load-bearing structural failure. Small, obsessive, exactly the kind of thing a kid who'd grown up watching her mother's world collapse under a stress point nobody predicted would build. I set the ribbon on the table next to my father's wine glass, the way I always did, hoping for 30 seconds where his eyes would land on something I made instead of something Preston broke. He picked it up. For 1 second, one real second, something in his face softened, and he opened his mouth like he was about to ask me a real question. Diane's fork made a small, precise sound against her plate. "First place," she said, warm as syrup. "Out of how many? 4? I heard Millbrook Prep only had 4 entries this year." The table laughed, my father laughed. A short, surprised bark, like she'd said something clever, instead of something designed to shrink a 14-year-old down to nothing in front of her own family. And he set the ribbon down next to his glass, like it was a coaster, and asked Preston about his lacrosse tryout instead. I sat there with a fork in my hand and my throat closing around a piece of chicken that suddenly tasted like ash, and I understood something that took most people decades to learn. That some people will never see you clearly, not because you are invisible, but because seeing you clearly would require them to admit what they'd chosen to look at instead. Preston, 14 himself by then, and already fluent in his mother's dialect of cruelty, leaned across the table once the laughter had settled, and added the finishing touch, the way he always did, quiet enough that only I could hear it clearly. "Maybe next year build something that isn't a science project," he said, smiling around a mouthful of potatoes. "Build something people actually want to look at." Diane didn't correct him. She reached over and patted his hand, proud, like he'd said something worth remembering. I picked the ribbon back up off the table beside my father's glass, while everyone's attention had moved on to lacrosse, folded it in half so the crease cut straight through the word first, and put it in my pocket, because if no one in that room was going to see it, I decided I would rather it disappear quietly than sit there being ignored in public. The betrayal that actually built the woman standing in that ballroom happened when I was 17, and it came dressed as a filing error. I had applied secretly, because secrecy was the only power I had left in that house for the Air Force's early enlistment pipeline into pararescue prep, a brutal, statistically merciless program that washes out over 80% of the men who try it, let alone the handful of women who've ever made it through. I needed a signature from my father releasing a small trust my mother had set up before she died. $11,000 meant for exactly this kind of thing. He meant for me to build a life she never got the chance to see. I asked him for the signature on a Sunday. He told me he'd look into it. 3 weeks passed. Then 5. I checked the mailbox every day like it was a countdown clock, because the enlistment window doesn't wait for anyone's family drama. On a rainy Thursday when the house was empty, I went looking for the paperwork myself, and in a drawer in Diane's home office, underneath 6 months of unopened boutique invoices, I found the trust statement. Not the release form. The actual account statement, 12 pages, My mother's handwriting on the original 1,998 trust agreement scanned into a bank system that had been quietly, legally, invisibly rerouting a fixed monthly disbursement, $600 a month, every month, since I was 9 years old into an account belonging to Diane Cole's boutique interior design firm. 15 years of $600 is $108,000. Not stolen in one dramatic heist. Bled out, month by month, invoice by invoice, $600 at a time, disguised as family administrative fees on a form my father had signed without reading, or read and signed anyway. I sat on the floor of that office with 12 pages of my dead mother's last gift to me spread across my knees, and I did not cry, and I did not scream, and I did not confront anyone, because I had already learned by then that confronting Diane was like screaming into a well. The only thing that came back was your own voice, twisted, used against you later as evidence that you were the unstable one. I read the memo line at the top of page 9 3 times before it fully landed. Administrative reallocation approved per family agreement. R. Cole, my father's initials, in his own handwriting, on a line authorizing money that had never once been discussed with me, the person whose name was on the account. I sat with that specific detail longer than any other single fact in those 12 pages, because a stranger stealing from you is simple math. A parent quietly signing off on it, year after year, is a different kind of arithmetic entirely. One I wasn't ready to solve at 17, so I folded it up small and put it away in the same part of myself where I kept the sound of a stopped watch. I photographed all 12 pages with a disposable camera I bought with babysitting money, because I didn't trust anything digital in that house not to disappear. I put the statement back exactly where I found it. And I did something my mother's daughter would do and nobody else in that house would have understood. I got a part-time job at a hardware store, worked every weekend for 4 months, and paid the $11,000 release fee to the pipeline program myself, in cash, out of my own hands, so that I would never, not once, owe my survival to a signature my father might decide to withhold. I left on a Tuesday, the same day of the week my mother died. Though I didn't plan that, I only noticed it in the car with one duffel bag and the watch wrapped in a sock at the bottom of it. I remember standing in the front hallway for a moment before I opened the door, listening to the television going in the den where my father sat with a drink he'd started at 4 in the afternoon, listening to Diane on the phone in the kitchen laughing at something with a client about paint swatches, listening to Preston's music thudding faintly through the ceiling above me, and understanding with total clarity that not one person in that house would notice I was gone until it was inconvenient for them. I didn't leave a note. There was nothing left to explain to people who had already decided, years earlier, exactly who I was and refused every piece of evidence to the contrary. I remember the porch light was off. I remember thinking, with a kind of cold humor I didn't know I had in me yet, that it seemed about right. The pipeline broke me in ways I still don't fully talk about. Water confidence training alone washes out men twice my size. Hours in a pool with your hands and feet bound, forced to control your own panic response, while an instructor decides, arbitrarily, whether today is the day you drown a little before they pull you up. I was the only woman in my class of 41. 29 of us were gone by week 6. I made it to week 6 by doing something my mother taught me without ever meaning to. Counting. 4 seconds in, hold 4. 4 seconds out, hold 4. Over and over, underwater, in the dark, while my lungs screamed and an instructor's boot rested inches from my face, deciding. I remember one specific afternoon, week 4, hands zip-tied behind my back, ankles bound, lowered into 11 feet of water with a mask blacked out so completely. I couldn't tell up from down except by the direction of the bubbles. The instructor's job was to watch a stopwatch and decide, purely by feel, exactly how long to let the panic build before pulling you up by the harness clipped to your vest. I felt my chest start to seize somewhere around the 90-second mark, that specific white-hot animal terror that has nothing to do with courage and everything to do with biology, and I did the only thing I had. I pictured the watch in my mother's shoebox, stopped forever at 4, Sushiti, and told myself that whatever was happening to me right now was still, at minimum, something I got to survive. They pulled me up at 140 seconds, coughing, shaking, and the instructor leaned down close enough that I could smell coffee on his breath and said only one thing before moving to the next recruit. Again. I went under 7 more times that day. I did not quit on a single one of them. There was an instructor named Marsh who made it his personal mission to see me quit. He wasn't cruel in front of the class that would have been actionable, documentable, the kind of cruelty that leaves fingerprints. He was cruel in the details. Before a solo land, navigation exercise through 11 miles of national forest at night, the kind of test that decides whether you graduate to the next phase or go home, Marsh handed me a compass he'd deliberately demagnetized and a map with 2 grid coordinates quietly transposed. He wanted a story. He wanted to walk into the debrief the next morning and tell the class that the girl got lost crying in the woods and had to be extracted by helicopter, and he wanted it to be true so badly. He was willing to sabotage the equipment of a 19-year-old to make it happen. I figured it out around mile 3, when the compass needle spun lazy circles that didn't match the terrain features I was reading with my own eyes. A different kind of person panics at that point. I felt something colder than panic. I felt almost grateful, because at least this cruelty was familiar, at least this one I knew exactly how to survive. I sat down on a wet log, pulled a sewing needle out of the small emergency kit I'd built myself against regulation, because I never trusted anyone else's equipment, after that trust statement, and I magnetized it the way my Girl Scout troop leader had shown me a decade earlier out of pure boredom, on a rainy camping trip, stroking it against silk in one direction, over and over, then floating it on a leaf in a puddle of standing water until it turned, slow and certain, and settled north. I drew my own map in the dirt with a stick. I walked 11 miles through the dark using a magnetized sewing needle and stars. I could see through gaps in the canopy, and I walked into that morning debrief on my own 2 feet, mud to my collarbone, 4 hours ahead of the fastest male recruit in my class. I stood in that debrief room with mud drying stiff on my collarbone, my hands still faintly trembling from 4 straight hours of adrenaline finally leaving my body, and I watched Marsh's face while he counted my checkpoint times against the master log, waiting for me to have failed at something he could point to. I hadn't. My arrival time beat the fastest man in my class by 51 minutes. He looked up from the clipboard, and for exactly 1 second there was something almost like respect trying to surface on his face before he buried it under the only tool he had left. "Beginner's luck with a compass reading," he said. "Loud enough for the room, doesn't make you pipeline material." I didn't argue. I reached into my thigh pocket, pulled out the sewing needle still balanced on its scrap of silk thread, and set it on the clipboard in front of him without a word. He looked down at it. He looked back up at me. He had nothing to say to a 19-year-old who had beaten his sabotage with a piece of thread and a leaf floating in a puddle, so he said nothing at all, which was, in that room, its own kind of answer. Marsh didn't apologize. He didn't need to. The senior instructor standing behind him, a woman named Colonel Ashworth who had seen exactly this kind of sabotage a dozen times over a 20-year career, and had simply been waiting for someone to survive it, walked up to me without a word, took the coffee out of her own hand, and held it out until I took it. That was the entire ceremony. A cup of black coffee, still steaming, passed from one woman who'd survived something to another. It was worth more to me than every ribbon my father ever set down next to his wine glass without looking at it. 6 years and 1 war zone later, I was a captain running search and rescue coordination out of a forward operating base when the radio call came in that changed the shape of my life a second time. A Black Hawk carrying a 4-man pararescue team had gone down 12 miles outside the wire during a night extraction. Hard landing, no confirmed survivors, hostile activity reported in the immediate area. Protocol said I stayed at the console. Protocol said a captain of my rank coordinates the rescue. She does not become the rescue. I listened to protocol for exactly the amount of time it took me to grab a headset off the wall and confirm my own name as led on the quick reaction force, because I have never in my life been able to sit behind a desk and listen to good men die 11 minutes away by helicopter. We found the wreckage folded into a ravine. 1 rotor blade snapped off and buried nose down in rock like a spear. 2 of the crew were already gone. A third had a compound fracture bad enough that moving him wrong could sever the artery. I could see pulsing dangerously close to the surface of a wound that shouldn't have been visible at all. The 4th man, a 23-year-old pararescueman on his first deployment, was pinned under a section of the airframe, conscious, and screaming for someone to get the others first. Don't worry about him, get the others first. The exact thing every good man in that job says right before he stops being able to say anything at all. His name tape read, Rays. I remember it because it was the last legible thing on his uniform before the blood took over. I remember the exact sound his voice made when he stopped screaming for the others and started screaming instead about his legs. a sound I still hear sometimes in the half-second between sleep and waking, and I remember pressing my palm flat against the airframe above his chest and telling him to look at me. Only me. Nowhere else. While 3 of us counted to 3 in a language that had stopped being English and become something closer to pure will. Getting the airframe off him required 4 of us lifting in a coordinated count, while small arms fire cracked somewhere in the tree line close enough that I felt the pressure change against my ear. I took a fragment across my left forearm doing it, a piece of hot metal that opened me down to muscle, and I did not feel it until 40 minutes later because there wasn't room in my head for it yet. We got him out. We got all 3 of them onto the extraction bird. I held direct pressure on an artery with 2 fingers and my own body weight for the entire 9-minute flight back, my mouth 6 inches from Reyes's ear, telling him the same 4 words on repeat because I couldn't think of anything else that was true. You are not dying today. You are not dying today. You are not dying today. Somewhere over that last mile of desert, his hand found my wrist and gripped it hard enough to leave 4 small bruises that lasted almost 2 weeks. And I let him hold on. Because sometimes the only medicine you have left to give a person is permission to be afraid out loud. He didn't. I did briefly, in the sense that my heart rate on the medic's monitor apparently did something dramatic enough for someone to shout about it, though I don't remember that part. I remember waking up in a field hospital with my arm stitched and strapped and a nurse telling me I'd need to hold still, and I remember, 3 days later, being stable enough to be flown to a stateside military hospital for the reconstructive work my forearm actually needed. And I remember the television bolted to the wall of my hospital room, turning on by itself on a hospital-wide morning feed I had no way to mute. Diane was on the screen. National morning show, soft blue set, a box of tissues placed within photogenic reach on the table beside her. She was talking about the toll military life takes on a family, dabbing carefully at eyes that weren't actually producing tears, and behind her, filling the studio monitor, was a photograph of me on the tarmac the day we'd landed. Except it wasn't the photograph as it actually existed. Someone had cropped it. The 3 men I'd pulled out of that wreckage, the ones actually carrying me off that helicopter, had been cut entirely from the frame. My captain's insignia had been blurred into an indistinguishable smudge that could have belonged to anyone. What remained was my face alone, streaked with someone else's blood, eyes half closed, looking exactly like what Diane needed me to look like on television. Not a rescuer. A casualty. A tragic girl in a uniform, repurposed as the emotional centerpiece of a real estate charity campaign my father's company had launched that same week, offering hero housing discounts that, as I would later learn, moved almost no actual product, except a wave of glowing press for the Cole family name. My phone rang before the segment even ended. My father, not asking whether the surgeons had gotten all the shrapnel, not asking whether I was in pain, not asking anything at all about the 3 men I'd saved or the one I'd nearly become. "You're all over the news this morning," he said. And there was an energy in his voice. I recognized instantly and hated instantly the particular electric hum he got when a deal was moving in his favor. "Keep quiet. Let Diane run the messaging. This is good for the company," he said, company the way other fathers say daughter. I looked at the IV taped into the back of my uninjured hand, the clear tube feeding saline into a vein that had, 3 days earlier, been feeding me back to life. I pulled it out myself. It hurt exactly as much as you'd think. And I didn't call the nurse, and I didn't ask permission, because for the first time since I was 9 years old holding a stopped watch in a shoebox, I understood with total clarity that nobody in that family was ever going to protect anything about me except the parts of me they could sell. I called Diane directly. She answered on the second ring, mid-sentence, already talking about trending numbers, and I let her get exactly 4 words out before I spoke over her in the same voice. I used to hold a quick reaction force steady under fire. Flat, precise, carrying no room for negotiation. "You do not get my face again," I said. "You do not get my blood again. You are done." I hung up before she could finish her rebuttal. I called my father next and told him, in 6 words, that I would not be attending any further family events, and when he started to argue, I did something I had never once done in 26 years of being his daughter. I hung up on him mid-sentence. Then I opened my contacts and, one by one, with the same steady hand I'd used to hold pressure on an artery for 9 straight minutes, I blocked every single one of them. My father, Diane, Preston, 2 aunts who had laughed at that dinner table when I was 14, and never once apologized for it. I built a wall out of a dozen taps on a cracked hospital-issue phone screen, and it held better than every wall my father's company had ever constructed. For 4 years that wall held completely. I healed. I was promoted. I transferred into a joint command role coordinating combat search and rescue doctrine across 3 bases, and somewhere in the exhausting, unglamorous grind of budget meetings and after-action reports, I met a Department of Defense data analyst named Marcus Reyes. No relation to Danny, a coincidence Marcus found endlessly funnier than I did a quiet, precise man with a habit of pushing his glasses up his nose right before he said something devastatingly true. He never asked me to be softer. He never once suggested I take my armor off at the door. Marcus had a habit, in those early years, of noticing things nobody else bothered to the way I flinched, just slightly, at the sound of ice hitting a glass, a holdover from years of dinner tables where that sound meant a toast for someone else was about to begin. He never asked why. He just started serving me water instead when we were home together, no ice, without comment, and let me tell him the reason on my own timeline, which turned out to be almost 3 years later. On a night I finally told him the whole story of a stopped watch and a shoebox and a ribbon folded in half in my pocket. He proposed to me at 11 at night in a windowless office over a stack of budget printouts, sliding a plain silver band across a classified memo instead of getting down on one knee, and asking, in the same tone he used to challenge a flawed spreadsheet, whether I wanted a permanent partner watching my 6 for the rest of my life. I said yes before he finished the sentence. I put the ring on my own finger, because some old habits about not owing my survival to anyone else's hands never fully leave a person, and he laughed. A real laugh, the kind I'd learned by then, meant he understood exactly why I needed to do it that way, and didn't need an explanation. The wall broke. Or rather, my father found the one seam in it he could still exploit. When the Cole family company announced its 25th anniversary gala 8 months later, the same event Diane had, this time, publicly framed as a tribute to military families, complete with a keynote slot honoring my career that I had never agreed to, and was never actually asked about. I found out about my own scheduled appearance, the way most of the country did. An event program leaked to a local paper, my rank and my photograph printed under the header, "A Hero Comes Home," next to a full-page advertisement for my father's newest luxury development. Marcus showed me the article on his phone at the kitchen table, and I remember the specific, precise silence that fell over both of us while I read it twice, my coffee going cold between my hands. The photograph they'd used wasn't even recent. It was 7 years old, taken the week I made captain, and someone on Diane's team had clearly dug it out of an old press release specifically because it was flattering, professional, exactly photogenic enough to sell tickets. Nobody had called to ask permission. Nobody had called to ask anything at all. I set the phone down on the table, screen dark, and Marcus reached over and put his hand flat over mine without saying a word. Because by then he understood that some moments don't need commentary, only company. My father called for the first time in 4 years, his voice smooth with the particular confidence of a man who has never once considered that the world might say no to him. "It's good for both of us," he said. "You show up, you smile, you let us thank you publicly, and we quietly settle everything about the trust." Diane's prepared a very generous number. He named it. It was less than half of what had actually been taken. I said nothing for 11 full seconds. I have counted longer silences under fire and never felt them stretch that far. I hung up on him that day without answering either way, and he called back 4 more times over the following week, each message shorter and more clipped than the last, until the 5th one, when his voice finally dropped the polish entirely. "This is embarrassing, Vivian," he said, into a voicemail I still have saved. "People are asking why the woman on the program isn't confirmed. Do you understand what it looks like if you don't show up? It looks like there's a problem in this family." I sat in my car in a parking garage listening to that message twice, and what struck me hardest wasn't the guilt he was clearly trying to manufacture. I'd built a decade of armor against that particular tactic. It was the phrase he'd used without noticing, "what it looks like." Not what it is. Not whether it's true. Only ever what it looks like, to the people whose opinions had always mattered more to him than mine. I did not agree to attend for the reason my father assumed. I agreed because I had, by then, spent 6 months working with a forensic financial investigator named Priya Anand, someone I'd hired quietly, on my own salary, the same way I'd once paid for my own enlistment fee, refusing to owe my survival to anyone's permission twice in one lifetime. Priya worked out of a small office above a dry cleaner, and the first time I laid the 12 photographed pages on her desk, she didn't say anything for almost a full minute, just turned each page slowly under a desk lamp, tracing account numbers with the capped end of a pen. "This isn't sloppy," she finally said. "Sloppy theft gets caught in year 2. This was maintained." She spent the next 6 months pulling bank records through subpoena-adjacent channels. I never asked too many questions about, cross-referencing 15 years of statements against the original 1,998 trust document my mother had filed with a since-closed law firm, until she had built something far more complete than the 12 pages I'd started with. A full ledger, 180 individual withdrawals, $600 each. Every single one routed through an account belonging to Diane Cole's boutique interior design firm and reported, on paper, as family administrative fees. The morning Priya called me into her office for the last time, she didn't hand me a summary. She handed me the original authorization forms themselves, 3 of them, spaced roughly 5 years apart, each one requiring a co-signature from the trust's secondary trustee before any reallocation could legally proceed. I already knew, somewhere underneath the part of me that had spent 17 years hoping otherwise, exactly whose signature that would be. My father had not just allowed the theft. 3 separate signatures on 3 separate reallocation authorizations, spread across 15 years, were his. In the same handwriting I'd watched sign, report cards, and permission slips my entire childhood. He had known. He had signed. He had, at minimum once every 5 years for a decade and a half, looked directly at a form redirecting his dead wife's gift to his living daughter, and chosen, in ink, to let it happen anyway. That was the twist I hadn't let myself fully accept until Priya laid the timeline out in front of me on a conference table. It was never only Diane's greed. It required my father's complicity, patient and repeated, spaced out just far enough to survive 15 years undetected. The betrayal wasn't a single wound. It was a wound my father kept quietly reopening, on a schedule, for a decade and a half, while calling it love at every Thanksgiving table in between. I did not confront him over the phone. I did not send an email that could be deleted, denied, or lawyered into ambiguity. I let the silence sit for 8 months. The same silence I'd learned to trust as a 19-year-old walking 11 miles through dark woods with a magnetized needle, because I had learned by then that the correct moment to use a piece of evidence is never the moment you first want to use it. It is the moment your evidence and your enemy's arrogance finally occupy the same room. I walked into that ballroom 8 months later in my service uniform, not the gown Diane's assistant had emailed 3 times requesting, with Priya's 12 pages saved to a secure drive, and a single printed copy folded into an inside jacket pocket, close enough to my heart that I could feel the paper edge against my ribs the entire evening. I did not come to be honored. I came to watch the timing align itself, the way I had learned to trust it would, because contempt, left unchecked long enough, always finds an audience of exactly the wrong people at exactly the right moment. The ballroom that night looked exactly like every room my father had ever built his life inside of 6 chandeliers, a string quartet warming up in the corner, a step and repeat banner near the entrance, printed with the company's logo stretched 12 feet wide, and an ice sculpture of that same logo already beginning to weep at the edges under the heat of 400 bodies. A young woman with a clipboard and an earpiece intercepted me at the door, glanced at my uniform with poorly hidden confusion, and asked, sweetly, whether I needed help finding the coat check, as though a woman standing in service dress at a black-tie gala must obviously be lost. I told her I was exactly where I meant to be. She checked her clipboard, found my name under a section labeled Special Recognition, and went slightly pale before showing me toward a table near the back, as far from the stage as the seating chart could arrange, without technically excluding me altogether. I understood the placement for exactly what it was. My father had learned, over the years, that he could not stop me from existing at these events. So instead, he simply built the room around the assumption that I would stay quiet in it. I did not stay quiet in it for long. Diane took the stage 40 minutes into dinner, in a gown the color of old wine, and opened with 3 minutes of warm, practiced remarks about legacy and family and the values that had built the Cole name into what it was, remarks so smooth and so well rehearsed that I could tell, within the first sentence, exactly how many times she had run through them in a mirror. She thanked donors by name. She thanked my father, who stood briefly to a round of applause, his smile wide and easy, in a way I had rarely seen directed at anyone actually related to him by blood rather than by contract. And then, almost as an afterthought, almost gently, she pivoted toward the topic the printed program had promised the room all evening, a tribute to military families, and to one family in particular. She found me at my table near the back with a practiced sweep of her eyes, held the moment just long enough for 400 heads to turn and follow her gaze, and smiled the exact smile I remembered from a Thanksgiving table 22 years earlier. Diane's speech was the third time. The first contempt had been small, deniable, delivered over a dinner table when I was 14. A joke, if you squinted, if you were the kind of person who needed everything to be a joke to avoid calling it what it was. The second had come years later, when Preston, at a family lunch, I'd been guilted into attending during a rare leave, held court at the head of a table full of his college friends, a fresh drink in his hand, and decided my presence in uniform was worth a story. You know, she basically got a full ride out of the family, he said, gesturing at me with his glass like I was an exhibit rather than a person sitting 6 feet away. Mom always said Vivian needed structure more than freedom, so we made sure she had somewhere to put all that energy. His friends laughed, easy and unbothered, the way people laugh at a story that costs them nothing to believe. I sat there in my dress uniform, freshly promoted, 3 weeks out from a deployment I couldn't discuss the details of, and I did the math in my head in real time, the $11,000 release fee. I'd paid myself out of a hardware store paycheck, the $600 a month quietly funneled somewhere else for 15 years, and I said nothing, because I had learned, by then, that correcting Preston in front of an audience only ever produced a longer, more elaborate version of the same lie. Nobody at that table corrected him either, least of all my father, who sat at the far end nodding along like Preston, was simply telling a charming family story instead of rewriting a theft into a favor, one drink and one easy laugh at a time. The third contempt was Diane, live, on a stage, in front of 400 witnesses and every camera her PR firm had hired, reducing 19 years of blood and combat in a shrapnel scar. I still can't fully straighten my arm around into a punchline about a phase. That was the sentence she was standing on, chin lifted, waiting for her applause, when the ballroom doors cracked open behind 400 unsuspecting backs. Danny Reyes had not been invited. He did not need to be. He had spent 4 years becoming the kind of pararescue men other pararescue men tell stories about, and when he heard through an old squadron group chat that his rescuer's own family was about to publicly humiliate her at a black tie event in the same city he happened to be stationed near, he put on his dress blues in the back of a rideshare and arrived exactly as Diane finished the word phase, because some debts don't wait for a formal invitation to be repaid. The silence after his salute lasted 4 full seconds, I counted, out of 19 years of habit, before it broke into something I hadn't planned for and couldn't have staged if I'd tried. A second uniform appeared in the doorway behind Reyes. Then a third. Colonel Ashworth, the woman who had once handed me her own coffee without a word, stood in that same doorway in her dress uniform, having flown in on a red-eye the moment Reyes texted her what he was about to do, and behind her, filling in slowly, deliberately, without a single raised voice, came 11 more pararescuemen, combat controllers, 2 flight nurses who'd worked my ward the week I tore my own IV out, people whose names most of that ballroom would never learn and would never need to, because they weren't there to be remembered. They were there to be seen, once, standing shoulder to shoulder in a room built entirely around the idea that money is the only currency that commands a room. Colonel Ashworth stopped beside me for a moment before I crossed the room, close enough that only I could hear her. "You don't owe this room a single explanation," she said. "You only owe it the truth. Once, clearly, and then you leave." I nodded. It was the same advice, in different words, she'd given me 19 years earlier with a cup of coffee instead of a sentence, and it landed exactly the same way twice. I walked toward them across marble Diane had specifically chosen because it photographed well, past round tables of donors, who had, 40 seconds earlier, been laughing at a joke about my life, and I did not look at my father's face, though I felt it. The particular pale, sagging stillness of a man watching a story he'd spent 15 years writing get read aloud by someone who had all the missing pages. Preston sat 2 seats down from him, phone half raised as if to record something amusing, before slowly lowering it back to his lap, as the mood in the room shifted beneath him faster than he could process. I stopped in front of Reyes. I returned his salute properly this time, unhurried. And then I did the one thing Diane had never planned for in any version of that evening's carefully choreographed program. I turned to face the room, pulled 12 folded pages out of my jacket, And I read the number out loud. $108,000. 15 years. $600 a month. Taken from a trust my mother built with her own hands, before a stretch of wet highway took the rest of her future away from both of us. Redirected into an account bearing my father's signature, not once, not twice, but 3 separate times across 15 separate years. I did not raise my voice. I have never needed to. The room did the raising for me, a low, spreading murmur of 400 people recalculating, in real time, exactly which story they'd actually been standing inside of all evening. Diane's microphone, still live in her trembling hand, caught every word of it and threw it out across a room full of donors, business partners, and at least 2 reporters whose editors would run the story before midnight regardless of what any publicist tried to walk back in the morning. Diane's mouth opened and closed twice before anything came out of it, and when it finally did, it was smaller than anything I'd ever heard from her, a whisper close enough to the still live microphone that it carried anyway. Those are old family arrangements. That's not what it looks like. Nobody in that room laughed with her this time. I let the silence do to her exactly what her silences had once done to me at 14 years old, stretching it out until it became its own kind of verdict. And then, without raising my voice, I offered her the only mercy I had left in me. You can tell that to the Attorney General's office, I said, or you can tell it to the 400 people already recording you on their phones. Either way, I'm done being the story you tell to raise money. A woman near the front, someone I didn't recognize, someone whose husband's name was engraved on a plaque near the entrance for a 7-figure donation, stood up from her table and walked out without a word, her heels sharp against the marble, and 3 more tables followed her within the minute. The exact kind of quiet, expensive exodus that no publicist on earth can spin back into a good headline by morning. I watched my father's business partners lean toward each other in low, urgent whispers, the kind of whispers that end long-standing partnerships by Monday morning, and I understood that whatever remained of the Cole family legacy after that night would have very little to do with legacy and a great deal to do with a ledger. Nobody had ever expected to see printed on 12 pages and read aloud under 6 crystal chandeliers. I did not stay to watch the rest of the fallout. I have learned, in 19 years of building a life out of the wreckage other people left behind, that the greatest revenge available to anyone is not the speech, not the reveal, not even the 11 uniforms standing at your back, in a room that once called you a phase. It is simply this: turning around, unhurried, and walking away from people who spent your whole life demanding your attention, choosing instead to give them none. My father found his voice only once, as I passed his table, small and cracked, in a way I had genuinely never heard it before. "Vivian," he said. "Just my name. Nothing else." I stopped for exactly 1 second, long enough to answer him the only way that mattered anymore. "Return every dollar to a veterans' education fund by Friday?" I said. "Or Priya Anand's report goes to the state attorney general instead of staying a family matter. Your choice." Then I kept walking. Out through the doors Reyes had kicked open 20 minutes earlier, out into a parking lot lit gold by the same chandeliers I'd left, glowing behind me, and Marcus was already there, leaning against the car, having driven 3 hours the moment I texted him one word tonight because he had learned, in the years since a silver ring crossed a classified memo, exactly what that word meant, and exactly what it required of him. Nothing except showing up. I did not check my phone that night. I did not need to see whatever Diane's publicist scrambled to release before sunrise, or whatever version of an apology my father's lawyers eventually drafted for a story that 11 reporters had already filed independently by the time I woke up. Marcus checked his own phone once, in the car, and read me exactly one headline out loud before I asked him to stop something about a real estate legacy and a family reckoning, and then he set the phone face down on the console between us and drove the rest of the way in. The kind of comfortable silence I had spent my whole life looking for, without knowing its name. I slept 9 hours that night, the first time in longer than I could remember, and I woke up to a text from Colonel Ashworth, 4 words long. "Proud of you, always." I read it twice before I got out of bed. Reyes sent nothing at all, which told me more than any message could have. He had done what he came to do. And men like Reyes don't need thanks for showing up, they need you to keep showing up for the next person after them. And I intended to. By the following Friday, exactly as I'd told my father in that ballroom, $108,000 moved out of a Cole family holdings account and into a scholarship fund for the children of wounded service members, administered by a non-profit board that had nothing to do with my father's name and never would. I did not attend the transfer. I did not need to watch the number change to know it was real. Priya sent me a single confirmation email with the subject line closed, and I read it standing in my kitchen with a cup of coffee going cold in my hand, and then I archived it, because some victories don't need to be reread to be believed. In the morning after that, standing in my own kitchen with sunlight cutting flat gold lines across the counter, I opened the top drawer where I keep the things that actually matter, a spare magazine I never use anymore, Marcus's grandfather's compass, and a plain gold watch that stopped at 4:47 inches the afternoon 19 years ago, and never moved again. I turned it over once in my hand, the way I have 1,000 mornings before this one, and for the first time in 19 years, the silence coming off it didn't feel like grief. It felt like something closer to permission. My mother built a trust to give me a future she wouldn't live to see. It took 15 stolen years, one burning helicopter, a demagnetized compass, and 400 strangers in a marble ballroom for that future to finally, fully, belong to me. I put the watch back in the drawer, poured a second cup of coffee, and went to work. Because the men and women I actually answered to were waiting on a briefing, and unlike some families, they had never once needed me to bleed for their attention before they were willing to give me theirs. Somewhere behind me, in a house I will likely never set foot in again, a man who once signed away his daughter's future in 5-year intervals was learning, slowly and far too late, exactly what it costs to be loved by someone who finally stopped asking for permission to survive.